Finishing a stew without burning a scrap of coal, sealing eggs in lard to last through winter, scrubbing every carrot to the bone rather than peeling. Nobody wrote these tricks down. The women who knew them are gone. Here are 30 genius British wartime cooking tricks that actually save you money. You scrape the dripping onto a slice of the national loaf. The dripping was the fat and the jellied dark meat juices that congealed in the bottom of the roasting tin. You added a pinch of salt, and that was Monday's breakfast. The ritual was inseparable from the Sunday roast that preceded it. Your nan would pour the liquid fat off first into a white basin, then come back for the dark jelly underneath, which held the real flavour, the caramelized onion bits, the last ghost of the joint itself. You never wasted it. You never threw the tin straight into the washing up. The dripping basin lived on the back of the hob between uses. Adding to it each time you cooked, with every rasher of bacon, every bit of mince, every sausage, was simply the way things worked. Today, the roasting tin goes straight into the sink. The trick died somewhere between her kitchen and yours. Nothing stale ever left the house. A loaf that had gone hard was not a loaf that had gone wrong. It was a loaf waiting to become something else. Soaked in cold water and squeezed dry, stale bread could bulk out a stew, stand in for the meat in a no-meat shepherd's pie alongside an oxo cube and a spoon of dripping, or be beaten into a breadcrumb coating for whatever scraps of protein the ration book allowed that week. During the 1940s, when the Ministry of Food tracked what households discarded, bread waste was effectively zero, not because of virtue, but because hunger was a more efficient teacher than any leaflet. The bread pudding your grandmother made wasn't a recipe. It was a way of making sure nothing was wasted before the next loaf arrived. She didn't think of it as clever. It was just what bread was for. Marguerite Patten said it plainly. You never peeled a carrot. You washed it hard with a brush, cut the top off as thin as you possibly could, and cooked it in its skin. The Ministry of Food put it in writing: scrub, don't peel, because the peel held nutrients and it held bulk, and every gram surrendered to a vegetable peeler was a gram that did not feed anyone. The same principle ran through the whole wartime kitchen. Potato skins were left on whenever the dish allowed, outer cabbage leaves were stripped into stock, the woody bases of leeks went into the pot with the bones. None of it was precious or deliberate. It was just how you cooked when you had to count every ounce. The cooks who grew up in these kitchens never lost the habit. You would watch them at the sink decades later, still scrubbing, never peeling, working fast and without a thought. But before any of that reached the hob, there were the bones. Every butcher in wartime Britain sold bones cheaply, sometimes for nothing, and a good cook knew to crack them open before they went into the pot. The marrow inside was fat and flavour, and a long afternoon of simmering would draw it out into the stock. Cracking the bones was not optional. It was the difference between a clear broth and something that could hold a meal. The pot itself never fully emptied. You topped it up, added the morning's vegetable water, dropped in the bacon rinds, the chicken giblets, the celery tops. By midweek, it was a different thing entirely from what you started on Monday, darker, richer, and thick enough to coat a spoon. A stockpot like that costs almost nothing to run when the hob is already lit for something else. The women who kept them going did not call it stock. They called it the base. Everything else in the kitchen was built on top of it. The transition from store cupboard staples into the ministry's invented substitutes brought in powdered egg, and nobody pretended to like it. The smell when you added water to the grey-yellow powder was enough to clear the kitchen, and the texture bore no real resemblance to what came out of a shell. The Ministry of Food shipped dried egg in from America under the Lend-Lease Agreement from 1942. and a tin was the difference between a cake that rose and a flat disc on a greased tray. Women learned to beat it longer than a real egg, to add a pinch more baking powder, to mix it with a little milk first. They learned its rhythms. Your grandmother would have known exactly how much liquid to add by the look of the batter, not the instructions on the tin. When real eggs came back after rationing ended in 1954, she cracked 2 into a pan and said nothing. She just stood there watching them set. Before the war, nobody put carrots in a cake. By 1942, half the nation's kitchens were doing it. The Ministry of Food understood that the carrot's natural sugars, released fully by cooking, could replace a portion of the rationed sugar in almost any sweet recipe and add moisture in the bargain. War Cookery Leaflet number 4 listed carrot sandwich fillings alongside carrot marmalade and carrot fudge. Carrots on sticks were handed out at fetes as substitutes for lollipops. The government's cartoon characters, Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete, spread the message through posters and radio broadcasts. The old cooks knew to grate the carrot fine rather than coarse, because fine grating released more juice into the batter and gave a better crumb. You did not taste carrot in the finished cake. You tasted sweet, moist, and enough. That was all any of them were trying to produce. The water you boiled your vegetables in was not water by the time you drained it. It was pale green or faintly amber, thick with the vitamins and minerals that heat had drawn out of the cabbage, the potatoes, or the carrots in the pot. Wartime Ministry of Food pamphlets were firm on this. Never pour it down the sink. Pour it into a jug. Add it to the stockpot, thin a gravy with it. Use it as the base of tomorrow's soup. The habit was so ingrained in wartime kitchens that women who cooked in those years never shed it. They would catch themselves reaching for the jug, even in the 1970s, with a fridge full of food and a supermarket around the corner. It was reflex by then, not calculation. You would wonder where the jug was before you remembered you did not need to save it anymore. The knowing was in the hands, not the head. The Haybox cooker was exactly what it sounds like, a wooden box or reinforced tea chest, lined thick with hay or crumpled newspaper or old blankets, deep enough to swallow a pot with its lid on. You brought your stew or your porridge to a hard boil on the hob, lid clamped tight, then lifted it straight into the Haybox and packed the insulation around it on all sides. The heat already in the pot did the rest. A stew that would have needed 2 hours on the coal range finished itself in 4 to 6 hours in the box, using nothing more. During the Blitz, when gas pressure dropped across London and coal was strictly rationed, the Haybox was the difference between a hot meal and a cold one. Women built them from whatever was available. There were no instructions worth following once you understood the principle. Retain the heat, seal the lid, trust the insulation. If you lifted the lid to check, you had already lost. Pearl barley went into a stew the way mortar goes into brickwork. It filled every gap, swelled quietly, and turned a thin broth into something that could feed 6 when the meat was barely enough for 2. A handful cost almost nothing from the corner shop, and it added body that a thin meat stock simply could not produce on its own. The trick was adding it early, a full hour before serving, so it had time to absorb the stock and give back starch in return. Dumplings came from the same logic. Lard, flour, cold water, a pinch of salt, mixed until it just came together, then dropped in 20 minutes before the plates went on the table. You did not measure. You mixed until it felt right in your hands, slightly sticky, not wet. She made them without looking at her hands. The dumplings, grey-white and steaming, were the thing the kids remembered. Not the broth. The dumplings. The Ministry of Food launched the Dig for Victory campaign in October 1939, 1 month after war was declared. By 1943, an estimated 1.4 million allotments were in use across Britain, flower beds cleared, front gardens turned over, bomb craters planted. In London, parcels of royal park land were distributed to households with no garden of their own. Buckingham Palace's rose garden was dug up and planted with vegetables. When commercial fertilizer disappeared, mothers sent children into the street with a bucket and shovel whenever a delivery horse passed, racing to collect the manure before a neighbor got there first. The humiliation was quickly forgotten. The carrots that came up in August were not. Your grandfather tended that patch after his factory shift, in the dark sometimes in winter, working by feel. It wasn't a hobby. It was the difference between eating properly in November and not eating at all. While the allotment fed the family through the week, the pig club fed the street. Communities across Britain in the 1940s pooled household scraps, potato peelings, stale crusts and cabbage tops to feed a collectively owned pig. If you joined, you registered the arrangement with the local authority and surrendered your meat coupons in exchange. Many councils placed food waste bins on street corners for households not in a club, sending the collected scraps to farms to fatten pigs for the national effort. Even military stations ran their own pig clubs. When the pig was slaughtered, the meat was divided among the contributing households, pork that had cost each family nothing but their scraps and their coupons. The rules were clear. Private pigs had to be registered, and half the animal was supposed to go to the government. Not everyone followed that rule. Nobody talked about it. Before the war, Britain imported around 70% of its food, roughly 20 million tons a year, and bananas were among the early casualties of the Atlantic blockade. They vanished in 1940 and did not return until 1946. Some children who grew up in the war years did not see their first real banana until they were 10 or 12. Into that absence stepped the parsnip. Cooked until soft, mashed smooth, mixed with caster sugar and a few drops of banana essence. The artificial flavouring that somehow smelled more like banana than bananas did, and spread between two slices of the national loaf. Marguerite Patten served mock banana on squares of toast at the reopening of the cabinet war rooms decades later. One woman who made it during the war said her husband loved it, convinced she had found real bananas somewhere. When she told him the truth, he refused to eat it again. The taste was the same. The betrayal was something else. Woolton pie arrived in April 1941 when the Times printed the official recipe under the name of Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food. It had been created by François Latry, the chef at the Savoy Hotel, and the incongruity of a Savoy kitchen producing the nation's austerity centerpiece was not lost on anyone. The pie was a jumble of whatever root vegetables could be found: carrots, parsnips, potatoes, swede, spring onions, simmered in oatmeal stock until just tender. Then it was turned into a baking dish, covered with a crust of wholemeal pastry or mashed potato, and baked until brown. The ministry pushed it hard through leaflets, radio, and cinema shorts. The public received it less warmly. An Aberdeen dishwasher who worked in a restaurant that served it was asked what she thought. Her verdict: dry and uneatable. It appeared on thousands of tables regardless. You made what you had. You didn't have to love it. From 1942, the only bread you could legally buy or bake in Britain was the national loaf, a dense, grey-brown wholemeal made from 85% extraction national flour, which the government had quietly fortified with chalk to ensure the population got enough calcium from a diet stripped of dairy. White flour was banned. Bakers were permitted to bake only on certain days of the week to conserve fuel. Bread could not legally be sold fresh. It had to be at least a day old, because stale bread, cut thinner, went further. The colour shocked people who had grown up on white. Some never forgave it. One woman recalled her mother ending the war years weighing just under 8 stone, partly because she found the grey loaf so unappetizing she often skipped it entirely. Scottish baker Doris Grant developed her own wholemeal loaf with no kneading and a single rise that people baked at home as an alternative to the official issue. The bakers who knew the dough, who adjusted the water and who proved it longer, got something closer to bread. The ones who did not got a brick. If the official recipes were the public face of wartime thrift, the sharpest tricks happened quietly, between women who had learned from their mothers. Rubbing a raw egg with lard was one of them. The lard sealed the pores in the shell. Eggs breathed through thousands of microscopic holes. A properly sealed egg kept for weeks rather than days without refrigeration, and most wartime kitchens did not have refrigeration. For longer storage, women used water glass, which is sodium silicate dissolved in water and poured into a stoneware crock with the eggs submerged. Correctly done, eggs kept for months this way, a summer surplus carried through to February. The Ministry of Food ran demonstrations on both techniques through women's institutes across the country. You did not need a recipe to do it. You needed someone to show you once, and then you knew. Nobody taught you twice. There was a trick that spread through factories and offices like a useful rumour. Go to the works canteen at tea break, ask them to load your scone with butter, then do not eat it. Carry the scone home in a handkerchief or tucked in a pocket, scrape the butter off into your ration tin, and add it to the week's supply. It sounds too small to bother with. A quarter ounce of butter perhaps, lifted from a scone. But the butter ration in 1942 was 2 ounces per person per week. 2 ounces. Every scraping counted. Women compared notes on which canteen served the most generous spread, which member of staff could be relied upon for a heavy hand with the butter dish. It became a small, entirely unofficial economy of its own. Nobody called it stealing. Nobody called it anything. Tripe was off the ration until 1942, which meant the butcher could sell as much of it as he had without touching your coupons. This made it considerably more popular than it would otherwise have been. The stomach lining of cattle, bleached white and slightly honeycomb textured, was simmered low and long until it softened, then served in a shallow bowl with malt vinegar and white pepper. In Manchester and the industrial north, dedicated tripe dressers boiled it in large vats and sold it ready-cooked from shop counters. You bought it by the pound, took it home in paper and heated it yourself. It smelled strongly. It tasted a very little without the vinegar. The vinegar was the point. Your nan ate it without flinching and considered it a reasonable meal. The people who grew up eating it in the 1940s quietly dropped it the moment something better was available. They never mentioned it to their own children. It is the wartime food nobody admits their family ate, until someone else admits it first. Fats were on the ration not just because food was short, but because the military needed them too. Animal fat went into the production of explosives and lubricants, and the Ministry of Food collected household fat waste through designated collection points across the country. Every scrap of cooking fat was therefore doubly valuable. It was food, and it was war material simultaneously, which meant you rendered everything. Every joint of meat gave up its fat to the tin before the tray went to the sink. Bacon rinds went into the pan rather than the bin, fried slowly until the fat ran clear, and the rind turned to a crisp, eaten standing at the hob. The clear fat that rose to the top of the stockpot was skimmed off and saved. You never wasted a drop. The women who learned this in the 1940s rendered their fat automatically for the rest of their lives, the habit outlasting rationing by 30 years and more. Grated beetroot went into cake batter for the same reason carrots did, for natural sweetness, added moisture, and bulk, but it brought something carrots did not: a deep, dark colour that made a wartime cake look almost as rich as a pre-war one. The Ministry of Food recommended both in its wartime leaflets, and the technique required knowing how fine to grate the vegetable and how to adjust the sugar accordingly. Too coarse, and you would taste it. Too much extra sugar, and you would use up the ration on a single cake. The old cooks knew to wring the grated beetroot in a cloth first to remove excess moisture before it went into the batter, otherwise the sponge came out heavy. That detail never appeared in the ministry pamphlets. It was the kind of knowledge that moved between women at the garden gate and the co-op queue, passed on in a single sentence that saved a bake. That garden gate knowledge needed somewhere to travel at scale, and in the 1940s it found a channel, the BBC's Kitchen Front, a morning radio programme broadcast 6 days a week from studios in Oxford Street, London. Marguerite Patton, who worked directly for the Ministry of Food, appeared regularly, teaching listeners how to cook creatively within their rations, introducing dried egg and haricot beans and carrot fudge to housewives who had never heard of any of them. The programme attracted 5 to 7 million listeners, 15% of the available audience, 4 times the size of any other daytime talk programme the BBC ran. In its first week alone, it received 1,000 letters. Comedy was built in from the start. Elsie and Doris Waters, one of Britain's most beloved double acts, presented 1 day a week, trading jokes about the ration queue with Lord Woolton himself. The woman who listened every morning at 7:15 is gone. The tricks she learned there are still worth knowing. Mock goose appeared on the kitchen front and in Ministry of Food leaflets as a centerpiece for the Sunday table when there was no meat to be had. The construction was straightforward and genuinely clever. Layers of thinly sliced potato alternated with cooking apple, sage and grated cheese. A full ration's worth of cheese, which made it feel like an occasion. The whole thing was baked in a covered dish with vegetable stock until the potato was tender, then it was uncovered to brown the top. The apple softened into the potato. The sage held the thing together. With the lid on and the steam doing the work, it came out of the oven looking like a proper Sunday bake, golden on top, giving at the edge where the cheese had run. It did not taste like goose. It tasted like something good had been made from very little, which in 1942 was the nearest thing to a treat most tables were going to get. Coal and gas were rationed, which meant the hob was used as little as possible, and every flame had to earn its keep. Wartime cooking pamphlets from the Ministry of Food went further than the Haybox. They advocated cooking all 3 courses of a meal in a single pot, simultaneously, each in its own basin or parcel, stacked in layers above a simmering base. The pudding basin went in first because it took the longest to cook, and it was sealed with greaseproof paper. The main course pot sat above it, and a dish for the vegetables rested on top of the main. 1 heat source, 3 courses, nothing wasted. You needed the right pots that fitted together, and you needed to know the timings for each layer without lifting the lid to check. The women who mastered this did not explain it. They just timed it right, every time, and the meal arrived complete. Meat was rationed by value, not by weight, which meant that for the same number of coupons you could buy a sliver of fillet or a large pile of scrag end of neck, oxtail or shin. The wartime cook knew exactly which side of that choice fed a family. Scrag end went into the pot with an onion and a bay leaf and barely a shimmer of heat for 3 hours. Oxtail, almost worthless by pre-war standards, simmered until the collagen in the cartilage broke down and the cooking liquor turned glossy, deep brown, rich enough to stand a spoon in. The cheaper the cut, the more skill was required, and the more skill there was, waiting in the women who knew what slow heat could do to a tough piece of meat that nobody else wanted. You didn't need the good cut, you needed the time, and the knowledge of what happened if you left it long enough. The best Sunday dinners in those kitchens came off the cheapest bones. Vinegar cake sounds like a mistake. It was not. When eggs and butter were scarce or spent for the week, The wartime kitchen reached for malt vinegar. A tablespoon was added to the dry ingredients, with the bicarbonate of soda already measured in. The reaction between the two produced enough lift to raise a sponge without a single egg. The crumb was different from a butter cake, slightly denser and a little tighter, but it was sweet and it was warm and it came out of the tin intact, which after a week of hard rationing felt like a reasonable miracle. Some women added dried fruit to the batter, stretching the sweetness further. Some used a scraping of margarine in place of the absent butter to give it a little more flavour. The recipe does not ask much of you. A cup of flour, a spoonful of sugar, the vinegar, the soda, a little milk. She made it every Friday when the rations ran short. There is no one left to make it now. By the time the second peak of wartime cooking had passed, what you were left with was this: a tin of dried milk, a block of margarine, a teaspoon of sugar, a drop of vanilla, and a grandmother who beat them together until her arm ached and the mixture looked almost like something you might put on a cake. Mock cream. 2 ounces of margarine, a tablespoon of dried milk, the sugar, the vanilla, beaten cold until it's smoothed out. Those who recorded trying it said the texture was slightly gritty and the taste bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing. Those who made it for children who had never tasted actual cream didn't say anything at all. They just put it on the table and watched the children eat it. The knowledge of how to make something out of essentially nothing, not just the recipe, but the patience, the willingness to beat margarine for 20 minutes to feed people who deserved better, went with her. The tin of dried milk is still on the supermarket shelf. The hands are not. Mock duck sat in the same tradition as mock goose and mock banana, the wartime kitchen's insistence that if the real thing was gone, you made the shape of it anyway, put it on the table, and called it what it should have been. Lentils were soaked overnight, then cooked down with onion and herbs until thick enough to hold a form. The mixture was shaped into a rough oval in a greased tin and baked until a crust formed on the outside. Some versions added a handful of dried fruit for sweetness or a spoonful of marmite for the dark, savoury depth that usually came from roasted meat. Served with the roasting tin's thin gravy, made from vegetable stock and a scraping of dripping, it looked from a distance like something had been roasted. Up close, it was lentils. But it sat in the centre of the table, where a roast should have been. The family gathered around it and ate, and nobody pretended it was something it was not. They simply ate what was there. Every summer that came during the war years had to be preserved against the winter that followed. Kilner jars, the glass jars with glass lids and a wire spring that sealed them airtight, lined the shelves of larders across Britain from August onwards. They were filled with whatever the allotment and the hedgerow had given up: plums, gooseberries, runner beans packed in brine, and tomatoes in their own juice. The Ministry of Food ran demonstrations through the women's institutes, teaching sealing temperatures and processing times. The Canadian Women's Institutes donated canning machines to their British counterparts, shared out between communities who had never bottled before. You needed to know how long each jar sat in the hot water bath, how to test the seal, and how to store them away from light. You needed to be shown. Once you knew, you didn't need to be told again. The larder shelves that held those jars through winter do not exist in most houses now. The jars are in antique shops. Oranges and lemons vanished from Britain's shops almost completely during the war years. Citrus imported from the Mediterranean and beyond simply could not be shipped safely when the sea lanes were mined and the convoys were sinking. Into that gap stepped the carrot, again. Carrot marmalade was grated carrot cooked down with the week's sugar ration and whatever strips of dried peel could be found or saved, the result potted into jars while hot and left to set. It did not taste like Seville orange marmalade. It tasted sweet and lightly bitter, and faintly of something that was not quite fruit, but was doing its level best. The old cooks knew to add a little lemon essence, artificial from a small brown bottle, to push the flavour closer to the real thing. Some of them kept making it years after the war, long after proper marmalade came back, because they had grown accustomed to the particular taste of making do. Old habits do not leave cleanly. The standard national margarine, which came in two types, a basic version and a slightly better special, was widely reported to taste of very little except its own wrongness. Many people who ate it said it tasted like melted candles. The butter ration was 2 ounces per person per week, which was not enough to butter bread for 7 days, let alone cook with. So some households combined them. The small pat of real butter was worked into the larger block of margarine until the whole thing became a single pale yellow spread. The butter flavour did not stretch far, but it reached further than it would have alone, and the margarine became something closer to edible. The mixing was done at the kitchen table, usually on a Sunday, usually by the same hands, in the same bowl, until the bowl was passed down and those hands stopped. The woman who knew the exact ratio, how much butter it took to redeem a week's margarine, is not here to tell you. But the principle survives. A small amount of something real carries a larger amount of ordinary further than either could go alone. By Friday, the dripping bowl was usually empty. You knew it before you looked. You could tell from the weight of it, lifted down from the back of the hob, lighter than it should be. You scraped the sides with a knife anyway, got what was left onto a heel of bread, and that was that until Sunday brought the next joint and the next rendering. The bowl going empty was not a crisis. It was just the shape of the week, full at the start, gone by the end, because nothing stayed, nothing was wasted, and every scrap had fed someone. The kitchens that ran on this logic are mostly gone now. The women who kept the dripping tin on the back of the hob are gone. What they knew, how to stretch almost nothing across an entire week and still put something warm on the table every single day, went with them quietly, without ceremony, and most of us didn't notice until we needed it. These kitchens are gone, and so are the hands that ran them. If any of this brought one back, leave it in the comments.